1763, Great Britain was victorious in the French and Indian War, and they had acquired this huge empire. But the country was faced with this enormous debt to pay for this war. And the Bank of England and the investors, the British investors in the Bank of England, were expecting the British government to pay off this debt and to honor its debt. In the years following the war, the British government sought to pay off these debts by taxing the American colonies and collecting more revenue from them and more strictly exercising their control over these colonies. Now, you got to remember that the American colonists had been accustomed to years of what we call benign or salutary neglect. So to all of a sudden have to face a government that was demanding new taxes and revenues and more strict control, this made many colonists very, very unhappy. And what we see happening is that Americans said that these new taxes were unconstitutional, that they constituted taxation without representation. And this would be a major problem that would eventually lead down the road to the outbreak of an armed rebellion by the colonists in 1775 and the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War. In this lesson, what we're going to do is to look at the beginning of this crisis. We're going to discuss the financial crisis facing Great Britain. We're going to look at the first efforts by Great Britain to try to tighten its grip on the American colonies and collect more revenue. We're going to look at the passage of the Stamp Act in 1765, which was the first direct tax imposed by Great Britain on the colonists. And we're going to look at how the Americans reacted to this particular situation. So let's begin by talking about the financial crisis. You know, as we mentioned earlier, to pay for the French and Indian War, the British government sold government bonds, and these bonds were purchased by the Bank of England and individual bondholders within Great Britain. And of course, they expected that these bonds would be paid back and they'd get their money back with interest, since they had sunk all this money into the glorious British Empire. And so many of the investors in the Bank of England included some of the wealthiest people, the merchants and upper classes, the merchants, the aristocracy, and they were anxious to see that that this debt was honored. Now, at this particular time in history when the country was faced with this financial crisis, the chief executive of the state was a man by the name of King George III, who had just recently come to the throne in 1760. And he was the first king of his dynasty, the House of Hanover, who actually grew up in England, and English was his first language. So he was actually the first true English king of his dynasty. And unlike his grandfather and great-grandfather, George I and George II, he actually wanted to play a role in the everyday government of Great Britain. But the problem was that he was really not that competent. And of course, later in his life, he went completely insane. But what he did was to appoint a series of rather mediocre ministers. He appointed ministers to run his government based on their personal loyalty to him rather than their actual ability. And these ministers turned out that they did not handle too well the American colonists. And since the British Parliament at this time was still largely apathetic to what happened in the colonies, they had no problem signing into law whatever George's ministers brought before them. So we see a series of measures passed by these mediocre ministers that served to create all kinds of problems for the colonists. Now, one reason why George III and his ministers decided that it would be in their best interest to make the colonists pay for the debt and to raise revenues among the colonists was that they had experience trying to raise taxes on the people of England. In 1763, Parliament passed a new sales tax on cider, which is an alcoholic beverage. Turns out that English peasants like to drink their cider, and this tax was not very popular. In fact, soon after its passage, there were widespread protests and even some violence across England because the peasants just did not want to pay this tax. So Parliament, faced with all this opposition, Parliament quickly acted to repeal the cider tax. So that got George III and his ministers thinking, well, maybe it would be a lot easier for us if we taxed people who live 3,000 miles away across the Atlantic. Because there you don't have to see the protesting and the violence. They're 3,000 miles away. So that probably was a factor in the decision by George III and his ministers to say, let's try to raise taxes among the American colonists. Now, you could make a case to say that perhaps taxing the colonists was justified, because from their point of view, the way they looked at it was that the Americans were prospering because of the British. You see, we know that from the mid-18th century onward that prices for American exports like timber and pork and tobacco and wheat, these prices had just gone way up, like by 30 to 60%. So the American colonies were prospering. And the way that George III and his ministers saw it was that their success depended upon the British military, the British Navy defending the seas against pirates, the British Army defending the colonists from Native Americans and Indians. So therefore, the British felt perfectly justified in imposing taxes on the colonists in order to pay for the cost of their defense. So that's how they viewed the situation. As we'll see, the colonists didn't view it in the exact same way. Now, in 1763, George III decided that his point man on collecting the taxes would be a man by the name of George Grenville. And now Grenville, in 1763, he had to find ways of raising revenue. Now, one way of raising revenue is cutting costs. So if you cut the cost of governing the colonies, that means more money that's coming in you can use to pay off the debt. So one of the great ideas of George Grenville was known to history as the Proclamation of 1763. Now, what this proclamation did was it basically told the colonists that they could no longer settle anywhere west of the Appalachian Mountains. Basically, it turned the whole area from the Appalachians to the Mississippi into a huge Indian reserve where this land was given to the Indians. And so basically, the colonists could not go beyond the Appalachian Mountains and settle into like the Tennessee or Ohio rivers, valleys. Now, the way that they thought, the thinking of the British was like this. They figured that as long as American colonists did not settle in Indian lands, there wouldn't be any more violent wars, like the war that they fought against Chief Pontiac. If there were fewer wars to fight against Indians because the settlers weren't settling on Indian territory, then that would mean that there would be more money for the British to collect and use to pay off their debt. So that's why the British passed this proclamation of 1763 forbidding the colonists from any more westward expansion. And many Native American tribes were quite grateful for what the British had done. In fact, both the Cherokee of what is today Tennessee and Georgia and Alabama, both the Cherokee and the Iroquois of New York and Pennsylvania, mainly New York State, both the Cherokee and the Iroquois actually made alliances with the British government. In fact, these alliances were so strong that both the Cherokee and the Iroquois sided with the British against the Americans during the American Revolutionary War. Now, these moves by the British, the Proclamation of 1763, might have been very popular among British ministers, but it proved to be very, very unpopular among the American colonists. You got to remember that their population was continuing to grow, and as the population grew, that meant that land prices got more expensive. And so there were plenty of colonists who just wanted to go across the Appalachians and start new lives and start new farms in the Ohio, Tennessee valleys, but they could not do so because the British government, by law, was saying they could not. So a lot of colonists felt betrayed because, in their view, they had fought in the French and Indian War as volunteers for the purposes of expansion and starting new farms, and now they were told that they were not allowed to do so. So there was a lot of resentment. That proclamation of 1763 continued to build throughout this whole period a great deal of resentment among American settlers. Now, some Americans just said, forget the ban, we're moving out there anyway. In fact, in East Tennessee, a group of settlers from North Carolina and Virginia settled and organized the Watauga Association to run their own affairs in what is today East Tennessee. Daniel Boone, the great explorer, he led a group of settlers into East Kentucky, and they organized their own government called the Government of Transylvania. So In some cases, settlers were just ignoring the proclamation and organizing their own settlements. But these settlements were open to attacks by Cherokees and Shawnees and other Indian tribes because since they were illegal, they did not have the protection of the British government. Now, another thing about Grenville was that he needed to raise revenues. You know, he was cutting costs, he wanted to raise revenues. So he pushed Parliament in 1764 to pass the Sugar Act. Now, what the Sugar Act was a modification of the earlier navigation acts of the 17th century. It created some new customs duties that had to be paid, customs duties on sugar, cloth, coffee, and wine, and it even added certain items, certain exports that the colonies could only export to England. So that was the plan. Now, another thing about Grenville was that he ordered all the colonial governors and other officials to collect customs duties. Remember, prior to this time, a lot of the governors and officials really were kind of lax when it came to collecting the customs duties, and smuggling had been pretty commonplace. But now governors were told, you better collect those customs duties, that's your job. Now, another thing that Grenville decided to do, another bright idea he had, was that he knew that when smugglers were caught and they were brought before a local jury, the local jury would be like, oh yeah, they're innocent. You know, you could never get a local jury would never convict one of their own on the charge of smuggling. So what Grenville decided to do was to create this whole new, all these what were called vice admiralty courts. So instead of going up before a local jury that would be sympathetic, now accused smugglers would go ahead of a judge, a British judge, who would make a decision right there and then. There would be no jury trial. The judge would hear the evidence and pass judgment, and that would be it. So this was designed to make sure that smugglers who were caught got justice quickly. And the whole purpose was to punish smugglers and make sure that smuggling stopped so you could collect more customs duties. Now, another idea that Grenville had in 1764 was the Currency Act. Now, what the Currency Act of 1764, it mandated that all taxes that the colonists had to be paid in coinage instead of colonial paper money. Now, this created a hardship for the colonists because you got to remember that coinage of gold and silver, especially gold coinage, was hard to come by in the colonists for a very long time. And so what had happened is that many colonial legislatures had resorted to creating or issuing paper money. The way the paper money worked was that the legislature would create what was called a land bank, and farmers could go to the land bank and get paper notes that were based on the value of their farmland. So farmers would invest in the land bank and then they could get notes back. And they could use this money as currency. But what the British government was saying now was that this paper money was no longer acceptable. So this made it even harder for the colonists because they didn't have a lot of cash on hand. They didn't have a lot of gold, and now they couldn't use paper money. And so this put a real hardship for the colonists. Now, by 1764, the colonists were feeling the full wrath of this situation. They were having to pay more customs duties, and existing customs duties were being enforced. And this took a lot of profits away from merchants. You know, American merchants in places like Boston and Philadelphia and New York City, now their profits were being cut into because they had to pay, out of their profits, they had to pay up front these customs duties to the British government. And that hurt their bottom line. Of course, this affected everybody else in these towns because when merchants lost money, that meant they could hire fewer workers, and so it kind of filtered down to everybody else being affected by these measures. Also, colonists could not stand the vice admiralty courts because there was a tradition in English government that everybody had a right to a jury. I mean, that a right to a jury trial was a fundamental right of all Englishmen, and many colonists felt that these vice admiralty courts were violating their rights as Englishmen. So by 1764, another problem was that the Currency Act was just really hurting the economy because without there being cash or money available, with a shortage of money, that meant that it was harder and harder for people to buy stuff. You can't really buy anything if you don't have any money to spend to buy anything. So basically you had an economic downturn affecting all of the major towns Boston, Philadelphia, New York City, going on in 1764 and into 1765. So people were generally very unhappy. As we know from today, when economy is not doing well, people generally tend to be a little pessimistic and unhappy. So given this situation, Grenville finally created the biggest headache for the colonists when he got Parliament in 1765 to pass the Stamp Act. Now this was the straw that broke the camel's back for a lot of colonists. You know, they'd put up with a lot, but this Stamp Act, it was like a big deal because it was a direct tax. You see, what the Stamp Act did was it required all the colonists to purchase these revenue stamps, and everything that was printed on paper had to have a revenue stamp affixed to it according to this law. That meant that all licenses, all newspapers, even playing cards, since they were printed, had to have a revenue stamp affixed on it. So everybody in America had to buy, all the colonists had to buy these revenue stamps. So these, now the customs duties, the higher customs duties only affected merchants and affected consumers kind of indirectly. But this was a tax that required, at some point, every colonist to pay this tax. And that's why it was so objectionable to many American colonists. Now, the one man who really got people fired up in this time was a man by the name of Patrick Henry of Virginia. Now, he was a young man at the time, newly elected to the House of Burgesses in Virginia, and he went before the House of Burgesses and he made a series of very passionate speeches. And he got the House of Burgesses to pass a series of resolutions, a series of statements, basically saying that this tax was unconstitutional, that according to English custom and tradition, and that only a legislature elected directly by the people could impose new taxes and laws on the people. So basically what Patrick Henry was saying was that the Parliament did not have any authority to impose taxes or laws on the colonists. Only the locally elected legislatures had that right. And the resolutions that Patrick Henry sponsored, they got printed up in all the local papers, and pretty soon it was hitting all the other colonies, and other colonial legislatures were passing similar resolutions. Now, from the Parliament's perspective, this made no sense at all. From Parliament's perspective, they believed that they represented all the subjects of the king, that they virtually represented. Even though Parliament was only made up of wealthy aristocrats, they still believed that they were the natural leaders, the God-given leaders of society, and therefore they represented all Englishmen and were there to protect the rights of Englishmen, and it didn't matter whether they were elected by the colonists or not. So the Parliament and the American colonists had two very different ideas of what constituted representation. And for the American colonists, the Stamp Act was taxation without representation. But the Parliament didn't see it that way. Now, what we see in Boston and some of the towns was that there was a violent reaction to the Stamp Act. In Boston, beginning in Boston and other towns, young men organized groups that became known as the Sons of Liberty. And the Sons of Liberty arose to denounce this new tax. Now, some of the leaders of the Sons of Liberty were merchants, but it also included a lot of artisans and shopkeepers and day laborers who lived in the towns. Many of them were people who were unemployed or couldn't find work or wanted to move out west but couldn't because of the proclamation of 1763. And they were just angry. I mean, they didn't have jobs, they had to pay taxes, and they blamed the British government and their policies for their situation. Now, some of these Sons of Liberty, these groups got a little crazy. They often would intimidate and harass and bully British officials, beat them up or scare them or hang them in effigy. And they would stage protests. They would march in the streets demanding change. So the situation was getting a little tense across the colonies. Now, in October of 1765, what happened is that delegates from 9 of the 13 colonies, they decided to meet at a convention. It's called the Stamp Act Congress. And here these representatives decided they wanted to send a message to Parliament and to King George. And basically they said the same thing that Patrick Henry had been saying all along. They said Parliament had no authority to impose taxes on them, that Parliament might have the authority to regulate trade between the colonies, and the mother country, but that was it. So that was the position of the Stamp Act Congress. Now, the situation was that tense, but then all of a sudden something happened that nobody foresaw. What happened is that George III got unhappy, George III, became unhappy with Grenville. For Grenville had not made some patronage appointments, and so for reasons totally unrelated to the Stamp Act, George Grenville got the axe. He was fired by King George III. So King George III had to find a new minister, and he found him. The new minister was a man by the name of the Marquis of Rockingham. Now, the Marquis of Rockingham believed that the Stamp Act was more trouble than it was worth, and all it was doing was creating problems. So he went to Parliament and said, look, let's just repeal this act. So in 1766, Parliament acted to repeal the Stamp Act. But members of Parliament, you see, they didn't buy into this whole Stamp Act Congress proclamation. They still believed that Parliament had the authority to tax the colonists. So even though they repealed the Stamp Act, what they declared what was called the Declaratory Act. And with the Declaratory Act, Parliament said that they did have the right to impose taxes on the colonists. So basically, even though the Stamp Act was repealed by the Parliament, you still had the same problem. Parliament still believed that they could impose taxes on the colonists, whereas the colonists did not think that Parliament had the authority to do that. Now, in fact, we know that Parliament, there was a precedent for what Parliament was doing. There was, back over in Ireland, Ireland had its own Parliament, and back in the 1740s, Parliament had issued a law saying that the Parliament of Ireland was inferior to the British Parliament, and that the British Parliament could impose taxes on the people of Ireland. So that had been done back some time ago. And so the Declaratory Act was consistent with the policies of the past of the British Parliament. This going back to, I think it was 1719 that this law regarding Ireland went back to. So we see by 1765 and with the Stamp Act that you see the beginnings of tension, the beginnings of problems, and as we'll see in the years that followed, that these tensions and the problems between the British government and the American colonists, these problems and this tension continued to escalate, and that will be the subject of our next lesson.